The night was busy at the luxury hotel. The lights were bright, and the dining hall was filled with the sound of glasses clinking and people laughing. The rich and powerful had gathered, wearing their expensive clothes, showing off their jewels and stories. In one corner sat a young employee, dressed neatly in his hotel uniform. His job was simple. He cleaned tables, carried trays, and stayed out of trouble. He had been working quietly all evening, unnoticed by most of the guests. Among the guests was a millionaire known for his cruel tongue. He enjoyed mocking people, especially those below him. For him, every dinner was a stage and every worker was a target for his jokes. His laughter was loud, his voice sharp, and the people around him laughed too, either out of fear or to please him. The employee knew this man by reputation, but tonight he would experience his cruelty firsthand. The millionaire's eyes wandered as he sipped his wine. He looked around for entertainment. Then his gaze fell on the young employee with a smirk. He nudged his companions and said loudly enough for the whole table to hear, "Look at him, he doesn't even look like he belongs here. Probably can't do anything except carry plates." The guests laughed, some nervously, others with cruelty. The employee froze for a moment but kept his head down. He tried to ignore it, tried to keep moving. But the millionaire wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair, his voice booming across the room. "Hey you! Yes you!" he called out to the employee. The young man looked up, his face pale. "Tell me, do you know how to do anything other than cleaning up after us rich people?" His words were sharp, meant to cut deep. The room quieted a little, some people turned to watch. The employee's throat went dry, but he stayed silent, not wanting to cause trouble. The millionaire chuckled, enjoying the tension he created. His eyes sparkled with mischief. Then he pointed toward the grand piano standing proudly near the stage. Its surface shone under the soft lights, untouched all evening. "Play that piano," the millionaire sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Play it, and if you impress me, maybe I'll date you." His words sent ripples of shock across the room. The guests gasped. Some laughed nervously, others whispered. This was no longer just a joke, it was an open humiliation. The employee felt his cheeks burn. His heart hammered in his chest. He wanted to disappear, to hide from all the staring eyes. He had never been put on the spot like this before. The millionaire leaned forward, raising his voice even more. "What's wrong? Cat got your tongue? Don't tell me you're too stupid to even touch those keys." His laughter rang through the hall, sharp and cruel. The audience waited, some eager to see the worker fail, others secretly wishing he would prove the arrogant man wrong. The employee's hands trembled as he held onto the tray in front of him. His mind raced. Should he ignore the man? Should he walk away and risk losing his job? Or should he take the challenge, even if it meant embarrassing himself in front of everyone? He looked at the shining black piano, memories stirring deep inside him. He had not touched one in years, not since his childhood. When times were better and music filled his home, the millionaire smirked again, waving his hand dismissively. Forget it, he's useless. Just another nobody. The words stung like poison. The employee's heart ached, but something inside him refused to stay silent. His pride, buried deep under years of hardship, began to rise. He put down the tray, his fingers tightening into fists for a moment. Then he slowly began walking toward the piano. The room grew even quieter. All eyes followed him. Every step echoed in his ears. Heavier than the last, some guests whispered, "Is he really going to try?" Others chuckled, expecting a disaster. The millionaire leaned back with a smug smile, certain of his victory. He thought the worker would embarrass himself and give everyone more reason to laugh. The young employee reached the piano and stopped. His reflection shone faintly on its polished surface. He felt the weight of the whole hall pressing on him. His knees felt weak, his breath short. But in that moment he realized something important. This was no longer just a cruel joke. This was his chance to show the world he was more than a uniform. More than a servant. He turned his head slightly, catching the millionaire's smirk from across the room. The man was waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to break. The employee placed one trembling hand on the piano lid and whispered to himself, "Not tonight." The tension in the room was unbearable, but for the first time in years, he felt something awaken inside him. The challenge had been thrown like an insult, but it was about to become something far greater. Everyone expected shame, but none of them knew what was about to happen next. The millionaire had no idea that his cruel sneer would open the door to a hidden talent, one that would soon silence the entire hall. The young man stood by the piano, his body stiff, his palms sweating. The whole dining hall was silent. No clinking of glasses now. No whispers of gossip. Every guest's eyes were fixed on him. The weight of their stares pressed down like a mountain. He could feel their doubt, their curiosity, and their hunger to see him fail. The millionaire leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass of wine with a smug grin. He whispered to the people at his table, loud enough for others to hear. "Watch this. He'll embarrass himself before he even touches a key." The guests chuckled nervously. Some of them were cruel like him, enjoying the humiliation, but some sat frozen, uncomfortable. They wanted to see what would happen, but also felt pity for the young worker standing at the piano. The young man's legs felt weak, like they might give out at any second. His heart pounded in his chest, thumping so hard he thought the whole room could hear it. He wanted to run away to escape this trap, but his feet refused to move back. He stood tall, shoulders squared, staring at the piano as if it were a challenge carved out of stone. The silence grew heavier. A child in the back of the room whispered to her mother, "Is he going to play?" Her mother hushed her quickly, but the words echoed in the worker's ears. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, slowly, very slowly. He lowered himself onto the piano bench. The soft creak of the seat rang louder than anything else in the hall. He placed his hands on his knees, steadying himself. The polished black surface of the piano reflected his nervous face back at him. His fingers twitched, but they hovered just above his lap. He was afraid of touching the keys, afraid of what might happen if he failed. He glanced at the crowd, and for a second he wished the ground would swallow him whole. The millionaire smirked and called out, "What's the matter? Forgot how to use your hands?" Laughter rippled through some of the guests. Cruel and sharp, the worker clenched his jaw. Closing his eyes for a brief moment, he tried to block out their laughter. He tried to breathe deep and slow. His chest rose and fell, his trembling hands finally lifting from his lap. He reached out and let his fingers brush over the smooth white keys. The cold surface sent a shiver through his body. He remembered the days when he used to sneak into a small community hall near his childhood home. There was an old broken piano there, and he would play until the caretaker chased him out. Those moments were the happiest he had known as a boy. For a second, that memory steadied him. It gave him strength. The crowd held their breath. Waiting for the first sound, some guests leaned forward in their chairs. Others raised their eyebrows in disbelief. The room was a mix of curiosity and tension. It was as if the entire hotel had stopped breathing. The young man's eyes lifted slightly, not to look at the millionaire, but to stare at the chandelier above. Its golden light rained down on him, making the moment feel almost unreal. He whispered in his heart, "This is not about him. This is about me," the millionaire scoffed, trying to break the silence. "Any time now." "We're waiting." His voice was heavy with arrogance, but underneath it there was a small crack, a tiny hint of impatience. He wanted the young man to hurry, to fail, to end this suspense that was beginning to shift against him. The worker pressed one key gently. The sound rang through the hall, sharp and lonely. The note lingered in the air longer than it should have. The crowd didn't laugh this time. They didn't clap either. They simply waited, hushed and still. His hands shook. But he pressed another key, then another. The simple notes floated softly, broken but alive. Each sound carried a piece of his soul. The whispers in the crowd died completely now. Even the waiters holding trays stood frozen, afraid to interrupt. The millionaire's grin faltered just a little. His smug eyes narrowed. He had expected clumsy banging on the keys, something foolish to mock. But what he heard instead was hesitation, yes, but also a strange kind of beauty in the silence between the notes. The worker sat straighter, his shoulders no longer hunched. He felt the keys under his fingers, smooth, familiar, like a long-lost friend. He pressed another chord, and this time his fingers didn't tremble as much. The sound was richer, deeper, filling the hall with something no one had expected. The guests exchanged looks, some of them wide-eyed, others whispering to themselves in disbelief. A man at one of the front tables leaned forward, murmuring, "He can actually play." A woman placed her hand on her chest. Her lips parted in surprise. The millionaire shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening around his wine glass. He forced a laugh, trying to regain control of the room, but the laugh came out dry and hollow. Nobody joined him this time. Their attention was locked on the worker at the piano. The young man closed his eyes and let his fingers wander further across the keys. The music was still soft, still uncertain, but it was there, alive. The silence in the room turned into something else now. It was no longer mocking. It was expectant. It was as if everyone was leaning forward, waiting to see what would happen next. And for the first time in a long while, the young worker felt something inside him awaken. It was small, fragile, like a spark in the dark, but it was real. He was no longer just an employee at that moment. He was a man with a secret, a man with a gift. The hall didn't know it yet, but what came next would stun them all. The young man's hands rested on the piano keys, the soft notes he had played still hanging in the air. His heart was beating fast, his breathing was heavy, and yet something deep inside him began to shift. The silence of the crowd gave him courage. It reminded him that they were listening, truly listening. Not to mock him, but to hear what he would do next. For a moment, it no longer felt like a cruel stage. It felt like a chance. His mind slipped back into memories he had locked away for years. He saw himself as a boy sitting in a small community hall. The piano there had broken keys, some of them sticking, some missing their ivory tops. But he loved it anyway. He would sneak in after school, place his small hands on the keyboard, and play until his mother came to find him. She would smile softly, saying, "Your father would be proud." His father had passed away too soon, leaving the boy and his mother to survive on their own. Music was the only thing that made him feel whole, the only thing that kept him close to his father's memory. But when life grew harder, when bills piled up and hunger pressed against the door, he had to give up the piano. He found work as a cleaner, then a waiter, then as a hotel employee. His hands, once meant for music, grew rough and calloused from scrubbing floors and carrying trays. The music inside him grew quiet, buried under the noise of survival. Yet now, here in this golden hall, under the sneer of a millionaire and the eyes of strangers, it was stirring again. He took a shaky breath and let his fingers press another chord. This time it came out richer, fuller, and more certain. The sound filled the dining hall smooth and strong. His body began to remember what his mind had forgotten. The hours spent as a child, the melodies whispered into his ears, the rhythm that had once been part of his soul. They all came rushing back. His hands began to move on their own, slowly at first, then with more flow. The audience leaned forward, their faces reflecting surprise. No one had expected a hotel worker to touch the piano like this. A couple near the front glanced at each other, whispering, "He knows what he's doing." A waiter carrying drinks stopped mid-step. Staring at the young man with wide eyes, the millionaire frowned. His smug smile slipping for the first time. He gripped the edge of his chair. His jaw tightening, the worker did not look at him. He didn't even look at the crowd anymore. His eyes were half closed as he let the music guide him. Each note was a piece of his story. Each chord was a part of his struggle. The years of silence broke open, and the melody rose from his hands as if it had been waiting for this very moment. He played a song he had once learned as a boy, a piece his father loved to hum late at night. The notes were sad but beautiful, filled with longing and memory. The guests felt it. It wasn't just music, it was emotion. Raw and honest, a woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man lowered his phone after recording, unable to look away. The millionaire shifted in discomfort. His plan had been to humiliate the worker, to make him look foolish in front of everyone. But now the room was no longer laughing with him. The laughter had turned into silence, a silence that carried respect, awe, and even admiration. He clenched his fist under the table, unwilling to admit that the joke had backfired. The young man's hands moved faster now, his confidence growing with every note. The tremble in his fingers was gone, replaced by steady, graceful motion. His rough hands danced across the keys as if they had never forgotten. The hall seemed to breathe with him, rising and falling with the music. The sound bounced off the walls, filling every corner of the room. Some of the guests closed their eyes, letting the melody wash over them for a brief moment. They forgot they were in a hotel dining hall. They forgot the expensive wine, the glittering jewelry, the arrogant millionaire. All they knew was the music. The young man had taken control of the night without even realizing it. As he played, he felt something warm rise in his chest. It was not pride, not yet, but it was hope. For years he had thought his talent was wasted, that his dreams were buried under long shifts and small paychecks. But now, as the piano sang under his touch, he realized the music had never left him. It had always been there, waiting to return. The millionaire's companions exchanged uneasy glances. Their laughter was gone, replaced with stunned silence. One of them leaned toward him and whispered, "He's really good." The millionaire's lips curled downward. His arrogance slipping, he forced a laugh, but it was hollow. Nobody joined him this time. Their eyes were locked on the pianist. The worker who was no longer just a worker. The young man's song grew stronger. His fingers moved like flowing water, each note chasing the next. His back straightened, his head tilted slightly. He looked like someone who belonged on a stage, not in a uniform carrying trays. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't just another face blending into the background. He was the center, and everyone knew it. When the song came to a soft pause, the room held its breath. No one dared to clap yet, no one dared to speak. It was as if they were afraid the spell would break. The young man opened his eyes, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He saw the reflection of himself in the polished surface of the piano, and for the first time in years, he saw not just an employee but a musician. And though the night was far from over, though the challenge had only begun, he knew in his heart that something had already changed. He had not only touched the keys, he had touched the souls of the people listening. What came next would decide everything. But for now, he had remembered who he truly was. The young man sat on the piano bench with his back straight, his hands hovering above the keys. The whole room was silent, the weight of the moment pressing against him like a heavy storm. The millionaire stared from across the table, waiting, his lips curled into a mocking grin. But even he was quieter than before. The air carried a strange tension, as if everyone knew something important was about to happen. The worker's fingers touched the piano again. Pressing a single soft note, it rang through the hall like a bell in the night. His heart raced, his mind was filled with doubts. But his hands did not stop. Slowly, carefully, he let the notes come. One after another, the music began gently, almost like a whisper. Each sound carried a piece of his hidden story. And the people in the room leaned forward without realizing it. At first, his hands moved stiffly. The years of silence made him cautious. His fingers hesitated over the keys. But with every chord, every breath, his body remembered more. It was like finding an old friend after a long time apart. His muscles began to relax, his movements became more fluid, and soon the melody started to flow like water down a stream. The guests forgot to eat, forgot to talk. Even the waiters stopped moving. Their trays hung frozen in the air as they watched the worker play. His uniform, his tired face, his calloused hands, all of it seemed to disappear under the glow of the chandelier. He was no longer just an employee. He was something more. The first few notes were quiet and uncertain, but now they grew louder, stronger. His music filled the dining hall, bouncing off the golden walls, echoing through the air. It wasn't just sound, it was emotion. It carried pain, loss, and hope all together. The kind of emotion no amount of money could buy. The kind of music that came only from a heart that had suffered and survived. The millionaire tapped his glass against the table, trying to laugh, but nobody joined him. The people around him were too busy listening. Their faces showed awe, some with tears forming in their eyes. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably. He was losing control of the room, and he could feel it. The young man closed his eyes and let his hands move. He no longer thought about the crowd or the cruel words that had pushed him here. He wasn't playing for the millionaire anymore. He wasn't even playing for the audience, he was playing for himself. For the boy who had once dreamed of becoming a musician, for the father who had believed in him, for the mother who had sacrificed everything. The sound grew richer. The room seemed to breathe with him. The chandelier lights glimmered across the piano's polished surface, and the music painted pictures in the minds of the listeners. Some imagined wide-open fields, others thought of childhood memories, but all of them felt something powerful. The young man's fingers danced faster. His rough hands moved gracefully, defying the life he had lived. People could hardly believe what they were seeing. "He plays like a professional," someone whispered in the back. Another guest shook his head, saying, "No, he plays better. He plays with his soul." The millionaire clenched his jaw. He wanted to interrupt, to break the spell. But he knew if he spoke now, he would look like a fool. He had created this stage, and now he was being forced to sit in the shadows while the worker shone brighter than anyone. The employee's music rose to a peak. It was no longer a soft whisper, it was a storm. His fingers flying across the keys with energy. Every note seemed to strike directly into the hearts of the people listening. The room shook with the weight of his song. A woman near the front gasped, covering her mouth. A man's hand trembled as he held his drink. The spell was unbreakable for a moment, The young man felt like time had stopped. He felt the world fade away and there was only him and the piano. His heart no longer raced with fear. It beat with rhythm, strong and proud. He felt free. Freer than he had ever felt since childhood. Then slowly he let the music soften again. His hands moved slower, the storm calming into a gentle rain. The sound melted into something tender, fragile, as if his heart was laying itself bare. The audience held their breath, afraid to even blink, afraid to break the fragile beauty of the moment. When the final note came, it floated in the air like a feather. Soft and delicate, the room remained still. The silence was heavier than before, but it was no longer filled with cruelty. It was filled with awe, with admiration, with disbelief. The young man sat still, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. His eyes remained closed for a second. Then he opened them and looked down at his hands. For the first time in years, he felt proud of them, not because they worked hard, not because they served others, but because they had created something beautiful. The crowd remained silent, but it was not the silence of mockery anymore. It was the silence that comes when people are stunned, when they are touched so deeply they forget how to react. Then slowly a single pair of hands began to clap, and another joined, and soon the entire hall erupted into thunderous applause. The sound of clapping filled the air, shaking the walls. The young man blinked in surprise, his lips trembled. He had never heard applause for himself before, never felt what it meant to be seen. The millionaire's smirk was gone, his face pale and tight. He looked around, realizing the attention had shifted completely. The worker had stolen the spotlight he had tried to use for mockery. And though the night was far from over, one truth was already clear. The first note had been the start of something far greater. The employee had not only faced the challenge, he had begun to rise above it. The millionaire had wanted a joke, but instead, he had created a stage for greatness. The applause echoed through the grand hall, hands clapping, voices cheering. The young man sat frozen at the piano bench, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a race. He could not believe what had happened. A few minutes ago he had been a nobody, mocked by a powerful man. Now, the same people who had ignored him were on their feet, clapping, cheering, and some even whistling. It was like a dream. The millionaire's face burned red. His smug grin was gone, replaced by tight lips and narrowed eyes. He looked around at his companions, hoping they would laugh with him and dismiss the performance. But no one did. Their eyes were still locked on the young worker, admiration shining in them. The millionaire clenched his jaw and tapped his fingers on the table. He had lost control of the room, and it enraged him. The young man slowly stood from the piano. His legs shook under him, his hands still trembled, but it was no longer from fear. It was from the flood of emotions surging through him. For the first time in his life, he felt seen. He looked out at the crowd, their faces filled with awe and respect. Some people even shouted, "Bravo! Amazing! Play again." A woman near the front wiped tears from her eyes, whispering, "That was beautiful." A man in a black suit whispered to his wife, "I didn't know a hotel worker could play like that." His wife replied softly, "Talent has no uniform." The young man heard their words and his throat tightened. He had been invisible for so long, yet tonight, his music had made him impossible to ignore. The millionaire forced a laugh. Loud and sharp. "Well, that was cute," he said, his voice trying to cut through the applause. "But it was nothing special, just a trick. Anyone could do it." His words rang false, and many guests frowned. Some even turned their heads away from him. His arrogance was no longer amusing, it was bitter. But the young man did not answer him. He didn't need to. The sound of the clapping was louder than the millionaire's voice. The worker bowed slightly, his cheeks flushed. He felt shy. But inside his heart was beating with pride. The piano, once a forgotten dream, had given him a victory no one could take away. The applause went on and on. It was not forced, it was real. People were touched. They were stunned by the raw beauty of his music for many of them. It was the first time they had seen someone play with such emotion. It wasn't just skill, it was soul. As the crowd slowly settled, some guests began whispering. One of them asked a waiter, "Who is he?" The waiter, still stunned, answered quietly, "Just one of us, just a worker." But his voice shook with pride, because tonight that worker was no longer just another uniform. He was something extraordinary. The millionaire's pride cracked. His sneer returned, but it no longer carried weight. He leaned toward the young man and said, "All right, enough of this little show. Go back to cleaning tables where you belong. But his words sounded desperate. They carried no power anymore. The audience ignored him. Their eyes stayed on the pianist. The hotel manager stepped forward from the back. A serious look on his face. He had watched everything quietly. Now he clapped his hands once, slowly but firmly. The applause started again, stronger. The young man's eyes widened. He had never seen his manager clap before, not for anyone. The manager's expression softened as he nodded at the employee, as if silently saying, "Well done." The worker's throat felt tight. He blinked fast, trying not to let tears show. He thought of his father, of his mother, of the nights when he played on an old broken piano. He had thought those days were lost forever. But tonight he had brought them back. Tonight, he had proved that his music still lived. The millionaire shifted angrily. He raised his glass of wine and muttered, "You think this changes anything?" He's still nothing, but even as he said it, his words fell into emptiness. No one cared what he thought anymore. The room that once laughed at his cruel jokes now listened to the quiet breathing of a hotel worker. The power had shifted, and he could do nothing to stop it. The young man sat down again, encouraged by the voices calling out, "Play more. One more song." His heart pounded, but this time it was not fear, it was excitement. He placed his hands back on the keys. The millionaire's sneer deepened, but the crowd ignored him completely. All eyes were on the piano once more. The first note he played was stronger than before. His confidence had grown. The applause had fed his courage. His fingers no longer trembled. They moved like they belonged there. The music rose again, lifting the hearts of the people listening, filling the hall with something greater than wealth, greater than pride. The millionaire shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Every note felt like a blow against his arrogance. He had created this moment to humiliate the worker, but now he was the one being humiliated. The worker's music had stolen his voice. The room no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the man at the piano. The young man let himself go completely into the melody. The notes rose higher, brighter. Flowing with power and emotion, the audience swayed. Caught in the current of his song, the millionaire covered his frustration with another forced laugh. But nobody looked at him. The spotlight had moved, and it would not return. By the time the song reached its final note, the crowd was already leaning forward, waiting. When the sound ended, the applause returned. Louder than before, it shook the walls. It felt like thunder. The young man bowed again, his cheeks wet now. His tears sparkled under the chandelier, but they were tears of joy. And as he stood there, soaking in the cheers, he realized something powerful. He had come here as a worker, mocked by a millionaire, but tonight, he had risen higher than any insult tonight. His forgotten dream had returned, and everyone in that room had witnessed it. The hall was alive with applause. The sound of hands clapping echoed like rolling thunder. The young man stood beside the piano, his chest heavy, his cheeks flushed. His heart pounded with a mixture of pride and disbelief. He had never imagined a moment like this. Not in his wildest dreams. A simple hotel worker, standing before the richest people in the city, and yet every single one of them was looking at him with respect. The audience began to settle again, but their eyes did not leave him. Some whispered to each other, "Where did he learn to play like that? Did you see his hands? So powerful, so graceful." Another voice added, "That wasn't just music, that was life poured into sound." These whispers reached him, and each one struck his heart like a spark, feeding the fire inside him. In the corner, the millionaire sat stiff, his wine glass untouched, his forced smirk fading. He shifted in his seat, trying to mask his frustration, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted left and right, searching for someone who might still laugh at his cruel game. But no one was laughing now, not even his closest companions. They too were spellbound by what they had witnessed. The young man looked down at the piano again. His hands rested on the keys. His reflection glimmered faintly on the polished surface. He felt like a boy once more, the boy who had sat at a broken piano in a quiet hall, dreaming that one day his music would be heard. Tonight that dream had come alive. He began to play again, softly this time. His fingers moved with confidence. No longer shaky, the melody was gentle, tender. Like a whisper between friends, it wrapped around the room, making people lean closer as if afraid to miss even a single note. The music spoke of pain, but also of healing. It carried the weight of struggle, but also the promise of hope. The audience closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. A woman near the front clasped her hands together. Tears running down her cheeks, a man put his arm around his wife. Swaying gently with the rhythm, even the hotel staff, who were always busy running back and forth, had stopped to listen. Trays of food forgotten in their hands. The millionaire's fists clenched tightly under the table. His face twisted. He wanted to speak, to shout, to remind everyone that this was supposed to be his stage, his joke. But he couldn't. Every time he opened his mouth, the music drowned him out. The worker's song was louder than his cruelty, stronger than his pride. The young man's body swayed as he played, his eyes closed, his lips parting as if he were whispering to the keys. He was lost in the music, carried by the emotions flowing through him. Each note was no longer just sound, it was a confession. It told the story of years of silence, of dreams buried, of a heart that refused to die. The hall felt different now. The glittering chandeliers seemed to glow warmer. The golden walls seemed softer, all because the music had transformed the space. It was no longer just a dining room for the rich, it had become a stage for truth. One man in the audience whispered, "He's not just playing. He's speaking." Another nodded. "Yes, he's speaking to all of us, without words." The people were moved not by skill alone, but by honesty. His music was pure, unpolished, filled with scars. And that made it beautiful. As the song grew stronger, the crowd's emotions grew with it. Some held their breath, others wept quietly. The millionaire's face darkened further. He felt the walls closing in on him. His plan had not only failed, but turned against him. He had lifted a servant into the light, and now the servant's light outshone his wealth. The young man's hands moved faster, the sound swelling into something powerful. It was no longer soft, it was fierce. His fingers raced across the keys, demanding to be heard. Demanding to be remembered, the crowd gasped, their hearts pounding in time with the music. Some leaned forward, their eyes wide, unable to believe that such passion could come from a man they had ignored just an hour ago. Then, as suddenly as it had risen, the storm began to calm. His hands slowed, the notes softened. The music melted back into quiet tenderness, like the end of a story whispered in the dark. The room was silent again, no one daring to speak. Everyone waited for the last sound to fade before they moved. When the final note drifted away, the silence was complete. The audience sat still, almost afraid to breathe, and then, as if breaking free from a spell, the clapping began again. Louder and stronger than before, people stood to their feet, chairs scraping back across the polished floor. They cheered, they shouted, they applauded with all their strength. The young man rose slowly from the bench, his chest heavy with emotion. His eyes glistened, he bowed deeply, his rough hands trembling not with fear but with gratitude. He felt alive, more alive than he had ever felt. The millionaire sat stone-faced. His pride shattered, his sneer was gone, his laughter silenced. He looked smaller now, his wealth meaningless in the glow of the moment. He had been defeated not by words or fists, but by music. The young man looked out at the crowd. Their eyes shone with respect, their applause was real. It was not pity, it was not polite, it was admiration, pure and strong. And as he stood there, he realized something tonight. He had been given more than applause. He had been given back his dream. And though the night was not yet finished, though the story was still unfolding, one truth was already clear. The young man had changed. He had stepped out of the shadows, and no one, not even the cruel millionaire, could push him back again. The hall was still echoing with applause when the young man stepped back from the piano. His face was flushed. His hands trembled from the intensity of the music. Yet his heart felt lighter than ever before. The crowd's cheers carried him higher, lifting his spirit into a place he had long forgotten. He bowed again, his eyes glistening with gratitude. The people clapped louder, shouting words of praise. Some stood on their feet, others whistled, and many smiled with tears in their eyes. But not everyone shared in the joy at his table. The millionaire sat stiff and pale. His face was red with anger and shame. His eyes darted across the room, searching for support, but there was none. His companions had once laughed at his cruel jokes, now they avoided his gaze. Their admiration was fixed on the hotel worker, who had turned into a star before their very eyes. The millionaire forced a laugh, sharp and bitter. He raised his voice above the applause. "Is this what you people are clapping for? A waiter pressing some keys? Don't be fooled, this is nothing, just noise." His words cut through the air, but they landed flat. No one cheered with him. No one laughed, instead the audience frowned. Their admiration for the young man only deepened. The worker looked at the millionaire, but his expression did not change. He felt no anger, no need to answer. The music had spoken louder than any insult could. He stood calmly, his chest still rising and falling with heavy breaths. The silence around the millionaire was more painful than any response. The guests had chosen their side, and it was not his. The millionaire slammed his glass onto the table. Wine spilling across the white cloth, he stood up, pointing a trembling finger at the young man. "Don't think this makes you special," he shouted. "You are still nothing." "Still beneath me." His voice cracked with desperation. His pride was slipping away, and he could not control it. But before he could continue, a man from the crowd spoke loudly. "You're wrong." His voice was steady. Filled with conviction, the room turned to look at him. He stood tall, dressed in a fine suit, clearly someone of importance. That music was not nothing, it was everything. It was better than anything I've heard in years. Others nodded. Murmuring in agreement, the millionaire's face twisted in rage. A woman near the front added, "We came here for food and company, but what we received was a gift. His music touched our hearts. Can you say the same about your words?" The room filled with soft voices agreeing. The applause began again. This time not only for the young man, but also against the arrogance of the millionaire. The worker's heart raced. He had never expected strangers to defend him. He stood quietly, humbled, letting the voices of the crowd answer for him. The millionaire stumbled, his authority crumbling in front of everyone. His cruel sneer now looked pitiful. His power had been stripped away by the very people who once laughed at his jokes. The young man lifted his head, looking across the hall. His eyes met the faces of the audience, and for the first time he felt like he belonged. Not as a servant, but as an equal. His music had given him dignity, and no insult could take it away. The millionaire tried one last time, his voice breaking. "You think you've won because you played a song? This doesn't change who you are." But his words sounded empty. They no longer carried weight. The guests ignored him, their clapping drowning him out. The worker stepped forward slightly, his hand still shaking but his voice calm. "I didn't play to win against anyone," he said softly. "I played because music is who I am." His words were simple, but they cut deeper than any insult. The audience erupted again in cheers. Some shouted his name, others clapped harder. The millionaire's face drained of color. The hall was no longer his playground. It belonged to the music, to the truth that had been revealed. The worker, once invisible, now stood in a light so bright the millionaire could not stand beside him. He turned sharply, his chair crashing to the floor, and stormed toward the exit. His steps were heavy with defeat. His shadow stretched long behind him, but it did not touch the young man. The young man's fingers rested on the piano keys. The applause still ringing in his ears, the millionaire had stormed out. His pride shattered, and the hall belonged to him now. He sat there for a moment, taking in the sight of people smiling, clapping, even standing on their feet. For so long, he had walked through life unseen, a shadow among the rich and powerful. Tonight he was not a shadow, he was the light. The guests called out for more. "Play again, one last song." Their voices were filled with excitement. Not mockery, they wanted him, truly wanted him. The worker nodded slowly, his chest heavy with emotion. He pressed the keys once more, and the room fell into silence. The music began softly, tender like a secret whispered in the dark. This time, the notes were not filled with fear or anger. They carried peace, acceptance, and hope. The melody floated like a gentle breeze through the hall, calming the hearts of the people. Some guests closed their eyes, swaying slightly, others held hands, leaning close to one another. The music spoke to everyone differently, but it touched them all as he played. Memories filled his mind. He saw his father again, sitting by a small window humming the same tune. He saw his mother, smiling through her tiredness, encouraging him to never give up. He saw himself as a boy, sneaking into the community hall to play on broken keys. His entire life had led to this moment, and now it had finally bloomed when the final note rang out. It hung in the air like a star in the night sky. The silence that followed was deep, not empty but full. Then the applause came again, louder than ever. It roared like a wave crashing onto the shore. The young man stood, bowing deeply, his tears flowing freely now. He had nothing to hide anymore. The hotel manager stepped forward, his face serious but his eyes shining. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder and said, "You've given us something rare tonight, something priceless. His voice carried through the hall, and the crowd clapped even louder. The worker's throat tightened. He had always been just another employee to the manager. Tonight he was something more. Strangers came forward. Reaching out to shake his hand, some asked his name. Others begged him to keep playing. A man in a fine suit told him, "You shouldn't be working here, you should be on a stage," a woman whispered. "Your music healed something in me tonight." Their words filled him with warmth. He had dreamed of being heard, and now that dream was real. Meanwhile, outside the hall, the millionaire paced angrily. His face twisted with rage. He had lost control. His cruel challenge had backfired. And now he was the fool. But inside, nobody cared about him anymore. His shadow no longer touched the room. The light belonged to the music, to the man he had tried to humiliate. The young man returned to his duties later that night, still in his uniform, still carrying trays. But people looked at him differently now. They smiled at him with respect. Some even whispered about the videos already spreading online. Guests had recorded his performance, and already they were being shared. His music was leaving the hall and entering the world. As he walked through the grand dining room, other employees nodded at him with pride. He was one of them, and tonight he had shown what it meant to rise above. He was proof that talent could live anywhere, even in the hands of a man overlooked and mocked. When his shift finally ended, he stepped out into the night air. The city lights sparkled above, and the cool breeze brushed against his face. He stood still for a moment, listening to the faint echo of his own music in his heart. He smiled softly. He had won something greater than money, greater than pride. He had won respect, dignity, and freedom. In the days that followed, his life began to change. Videos of his performance spread across social media. People around the world watched in amazement. Some called him the piano worker, others the hidden genius. Music schools reached out. Theaters wanted him to play, and strangers sent him messages of love and encouragement. The millionaire tried to cover his humiliation, pretending he had meant it all as a joke, but no one believed him. His name became tied not to wealth, but to arrogance. People remembered the sneer, the cruel words. And the moment he was silenced by music, the worker, however, became a symbol of something beautiful. People saw him and remembered that greatness can come from anywhere, that talent is not owned by the rich, but by the brave who dare to share it. One evening, he returned to the same hall where it all began. The grand piano still sat in the corner. Shining under the lights, he touched it gently. His heart filled with gratitude, he whispered softly, "Thank you." Then he sat and played again. Not for applause this time, not for fame, but simply because it was who he was. The music rose, filling the empty room, echoing off the walls like it had that unforgettable night. And as he played, he smiled through his tears, knowing that his life had changed forever. The cruel challenge meant to humiliate him had instead revealed his soul to the world. He had faced arrogance and turned it into art. He had found his voice, and the world was finally listening.